All right, so let's dive into something fun today, and maybe a little bit terrifying too. The world of horror movies.
Uh-huh.
But specifically, you know that question of why characters make such awky decisions? You know what I mean?
Right.
Those moments when you're just yelling at the screen to like, don't go in there.
Oh, yeah.
Our source material for today's deep dive is a YouTube video from Mr. Nightmare, appropriately titled 10 Dumbest Decisions in Horror Movies.
Yeah, it's true. Horror movies are definitely full of choices that make you wonder, like, how did these characters even survive this long?
Right, but here's the thing. Bad decisions are kind of the engine. That drives a horror film.
Right.
If everyone acted rationally and logically and made good choices, there'd be no movie.
Yeah.
No suspense, no thrills, no one to jump out from behind the shower curtain.
Exactly. Smart choices.
Well, they don't really make for good horror.
Right. So we're going to unpack some of the most outrageous examples and talk about why they work and what they say about us as viewers. But before we get to the truly epic fails, let's talk about why bad decisions are such a staple of the horror genre. It's fascinating how horror relies on this balance of suspense and tension. You know, characters making smart choices would often lead to pretty boring movies.
Right, it's like, oh, there's a creepy sound in the basement. Let's call the police and not investigate. No one wants to see that movie.
Exactly. And this need for characters to make questionable choices brings us to a classic horror trope, the final girl. And she often survives because she makes slightly better choices than her friends. But even her choices aren't always perfect, which of course keeps us on the edge of our seats.
Keeps us guessing. Okay, so let's jump into some specific examples. Starting with Jeepers Creepers. The movie opens with these two siblings on a road trip. Through like desolate countryside, they have this run-in with a creepy truck driver who is just giving off some seriously sinister vibes. Now, the scene plays on this common fear of being stranded and isolated.
Right.
And remember what happens next. They see him dumping something. That looks suspiciously like a body down a pipe.
And the filmmakers make it so obvious.
Right.
It's like they're daring the audience to scream, "Turn around! Don't stop!"
Yeah, they're like waving a big red flag.
Yeah.
But do they listen? Of course not. They go back to investigate. Instead of calling the police, they risk their lives to satisfy their curiosity.
It's such a classic horror movie trope that plays on our, I don't know, our desire to just no W, even when it could be dangerous. Curiosity may not always kill the cat, but in horror movies, it definitely puts you in the running for a gruesome demise. I think there's a reason why that phrase, curiosity killed the cat, is so ingrained in our culture. It speaks to this primal fear of the unknown, and horror movies tap into that brilliantly.
Yeah, it's like this morbid curiosity. We can't help ourselves. Okay, next, let's talk about the ending of Drag Me to Hell. Remember that scene? Christine thinks she's finally escaped this terrifying curse, only to make a last-minute blunder, involving a certain envelope.
Oh, yes, the envelope mix-up. Classic. Anxiety-inducing horror.
Oh yeah, so she accidentally throws away the wrong envelope, dooming herself. If she'd just taken like a second to check what was inside, she could have avoided a one-way ticket to hell.
And this is where the movie gets really clever. It taps into this universal anxiety we all have, that, oh no, did I just screw up feeling, magnified 1,000 times when it's a matter of internal damnation, right? It's also a brilliant example of how horror can take an everyday fear, like accidentally throwing away something important and twist it into something truly terrifying. Have you ever had that moment where you panic thinking you threw away the wrong thing?
Oh, absolutely. Every time I take out the trash, I have a mini heart attack, wondering if I accidentally tossed my wallet or keys.
Exactly. We've all been there. But in Drag Me to Hell, they take that everyday anxiety and crank it up to 11.
Okay, so those are two big examples. But let's do some rapid-fire bad decisions, just to highlight how common they are in horror films. Mr. Nightmare points out a few more gems. In I Am Legend, the hero sacrifices himself when he could have easily survived. Then there's I Know What You Did Last Summer, where a character runs towards safety and then turns back to look at the killer.
It's like they can't help themselves. It's that fatal flaw in so many horror movie characters. They just need to look to confirm their fear, even when it puts them in danger.
Right. It makes any logical sense, but it makes for a great jump scare, I guess. And finally, in Saw 2, there's this hand trap that could have been avoided by simply looking around the room.
These examples, while frustrating for us as viewers, really highlight how horror often relies on characters making impulsive, illogical choices that put them in danger.
Yeah, their own worst enemy in a lot of these cases. Speaking of illogical choices, how about a classic like Jaws? The movie features a mayor who prioritizes tourism dollars over beachgoer safety, keeping the beaches open despite the presence of a giant shark. It's a perfect example of how horror can reflect real-world anxieties.
Yeah, the mayor's greed and blatant disregard for human life really resonates with these fears we have about those in power, making decisions that prioritize profit over people, even if it means putting people's lives at risk.
And he actually says, look, we depend on the summer people here for our very lives.
Yeah.
As if that justifies putting everyone at risk. It's chilling because it feels like something you could hear on the news today.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones with sharp teeth and claws, but the ones in positions of authority who make reckless choices. And that brings us to The Purge, a film that really takes the concept of bad decisions to a whole new level by setting the story in this dystopian world where all crime is legal for one night. The Purge is a fascinating study in how societal breakdown can impact decision-making. Mr. Nightmare highlights a couple of doozies from this film. The first one involves a family hunkering down in their fortified home, hoping to ride out this night of lawless violence. They've got all the security measures in place, guns, cameras, steel doors, you name it.
They think they're safe. But then their teenage son does something incredibly foolish. He disarms the home security system to let in a stranger who's begging for help on Purge night.
It's almost unbelievable, right? But it speaks to the movie's themes of how fear and desperation can just completely override common sense, especially when you're dealing with a situation like The Purge. It makes you wonder, who would you trust in a world like that? Would you risk your family's safety for a stranger?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And then later in the movie, the whole family makes another questionable choice. They decide to leave the safety of their fortified room while the house is under attack. Like, they have guns, they have a safe space. Why would they leave? It's almost like they're looking for trouble.
Yeah, it seems illogical, but again, fear and desperation can lead to some pretty irrational choices. It's also worth noting that horror movies often play on this idea of characters being their own worst enemies. They make choices that ultimately seal their fate.
So The Purge definitely gives us a lot to think about, especially in terms of how extreme situations can impact our decision-making. Okay, are you ready for the grand finale? Mr. Nightmare's top 2 dumbest decisions.
Lay it on me. I'm ready for some epic fails.
All right, number 2 on the list takes us to Scream. Tatum, one of the main characters, gets trapped in the garage with Ghostface, the masked killer. She puts up a good fight, even knocks him down a few times, but then she makes a run for it and tries to escape through a pet door.
A pet door that's clearly too small for any human being to fit through.
Exactly. It's one of those moments where you just facepalm and say, why? Why would you even try that? It's such a classic horror movie death. Totally avoidable if she had just used like a tiny bit of common sense.
Even in these high-stress life or death situations, you'd think a little rational thinking could save the day. Unfortunately, in horror movies, that rarely happens.
And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for. Mr. Nightmare's pick for the #1 dumbest horror movie decision. Drumroll, please. It's the infamous foot amputation scene in Saw.
Ah, yes. The scene that launched 1,000 debates. Was it brilliant? Was it insane? Let's break it down.
So for those who haven't seen it, Dr. Gordon is chained to a pipe in this filthy bathroom. There's a hacksaw within reach, but it's not close enough to cut the chain. His only option.
Okay.
Saw off his own foot to escape.
Now, Mr. Nightmare argues that Dr. Gordon could have used the saw to reach the phone instead, which is technically true.
Right. And there's this whole debate online about whether the foot amputation was necessary or just a really, really bad decision. Some people say he could have used the saw to break the pipe or smash the toilet and use a shard of porcelain to cut the chain.
It's a fascinating debate. On one hand, sawing off your own foot seems a bit extreme, but on the other hand, he's under immense pressure, he's bleeding, and facing a ticking clock. So was his decision dumb or an act of desperate survival? What do you think? Would you have sawed off your foot?
I honestly don't know. It's just such a terrifying situation to even imagine. Like the whole point of the Saw movies is to put characters in these impossible scenarios where there are no good choices. But I think that scene, whether you agree with his decision or not, speaks to something really interesting about horror movies. They force us to confront the limits of our own morality and question what we would do in these extreme circumstances.
Yeah, actually. It's easy to judge from the comfort of our couch, but who knows how any of us would react in a true life or death situation.
Speaking of judging from the comfort of our couch,
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the final girl trope and how even she doesn't always make perfect choices. This brings us back to Halloween, Resurrection, and Laurie Strode's final confrontation with Michael Myers. Remember that scene?
Oh, yeah.
She finally has him cornered, and she's about to end it all.
But then, in a moment of pure horror movie logic, She decides to unmask him first.
Like, what are you doing, Laura? You've been terrorized by this guy for years. You know who he is. But she just has to see his face, to confront her boogeyman head on. And of course, it backfires spectacularly.
It's a perfect example of how horror movies often subvert our expectations. You think she's going to be the triumphant hero, but then she makes this one fatal mistake, driven by this need to know no W, this need to look into the abyss, and ultimately that's her downfall.
It's almost like a cautionary tale, right? Don't get too close to the monster. Don't try to understand it. Just run.
And speaking of running, let's revisit Jeepers Creepers for a moment. Remember the siblings' decision to investigate that pipe? That scene is a masterclass in how horror movies exploit our morbid curiosity.
It's like a train wreck you can't look away from. You know it's going to be bad, but you can't help but watch.
That's the genius of good horror, isn't it? It plays on our deepest fears and anxieties, making us confront this darkness. That exists not just in the world around us, but within ourselves. We might judge these characters for their bad decisions, but on some level we understand them. We felt those same impulses, those same urges to look a little too closely at something that scares us.
And sometimes those fears that horror movies exploit are rooted in very real, very relevant issues, like the mayor's greed in Jaws, which reflects anxieties about powerful people making selfish choices, or the societal breakdown in The Purge, which taps into fears about lawlessness and violence.
Exactly. Horror often acts as a mirror, reflecting our anxieties back at us. It makes us confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
So maybe those dumb horror movie decisions aren't so dumb after all. Maybe they're just a reflection of our own flawed humanity. We're all capable of making bad choices, especially when we're scared, stressed, or under pressure. And that's what makes these movies so relatable, so terrifying, and ultimately so entertaining.
It's like that old saying, there but for the grace of God go I. We watch these characters make these terrible choices, and we can't help but wonder, what would I do in that situation?
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to the Saw debate one last time. Was Dr. Gordon's decision to amputate his foot really that dumb?
It's a tough call. I can see both sides of the argument. On one hand, it's a drastic measure. On the other hand, he was in a desperate situation, facing unimaginable pain and the very real possibility of dying in that bathroom.
I guess it comes down to perspective. From the safety of our living rooms, it might seem like an easy choice to just reach for the phone or find another way out. But when you're trapped in a literal game of life and death, rationality can fly out the window. You're operating on pure instinct and adrenaline.
And Saw is all about pushing characters to their absolute breaking point, forcing them to make impossible choices. It's not about logic or reason. It's about survival at any cost.
And I think that scene, more than any other in the movie, really gets under people's skin. It sparks debate. It makes you question your own limits. And it stays with you long after the credits roll.
Well, I don't know about you, but after going through all of these examples, I'm suddenly feeling a lot less judgmental about those horror movie characters and their questionable choices.
Yeah, it's easy to play armchair quarterback, when you're not the one facing a masked killer or a supernatural entity.
Right. It's like those don't go in there moments. We all think we'd be the smart one in the group, but who knows how we'd actually react under pressure.
As we've seen, these decisions, while often illogical, are driven by very human emotions and instincts. Fear, panic, desperation. Sometimes even the smartest among us might make a boneheaded move when faced with unimaginable terror.
So maybe we should cut those horror movie characters a little slack. Their bad decisions make for some pretty entertaining viewing after all. Absolutely. Their mistakes, their missteps, their moments of sheer stupidity are what keep us on the edge of our seats, our hearts racing, our minds questioning what we would do in their shoes.
And that brings us back to our original question. What's the dumbest horror movie decision you've ever seen? What would you have done differently?
I'm curious to hear what stands out for you. Was it a moment of pure recklessness? A case of misplaced trust? Or perhaps a decision driven by just insatiable curiosity?
Honestly, there are so many great examples to choose from, but for me, it's hard to top Tatum's pet door escape attempt in Scream. It's so ridiculous. You can practically hear the audience groaning in unison.
It's a classic example of horror subverting our expectations, right? We expect the characters to use their intelligence and resourcefulness to escape these dangerous situations, but sometimes the filmmakers throw us a curveball and force them into these absurd scenarios. It's both frustrating and hilarious.
And it reminds us that even in the heightened reality of a horror movie, logic doesn't always prevail.
Exactly, which is why we love it.
So, dear listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of horror movie decisions, We want to leave you with this thought-provoking question. What would you do differently? If you found yourself trapped in a horror movie scenario, would you be the brave hero, the resourceful survivor, or the hapless victim who makes all the wrong choices?
Think about it. What are your instincts? What are your fears? And most importantly, do you think you could keep a cool head under pressure?
Because in the world of horror, even the smallest choice can have deadly consequences.
Well, thanks for joining us on this thrilling ride through the world of horror movie blunders.
Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you get in the car.
And remember, dear listener, sometimes the best way to survive a horror movie is to simply stay on the couch and let the characters make all the bad decisions for you.
Absolutely.